I'm Amanda Olke. I'm the Adult Education Director here at the Spy Museum. And I wanted to say that this series is our 16th Smithsonian series that I put together. So if you're new, look forward to more of these in the future. And if you are a frequent attendee, thank you for coming so often. It is really a privilege to introduce our speaker today. His book, The Spy Who Couldn't Spell, is fascinating, and he is a terrific speaker, and you'll notice his name because it's interesting, Yudhijit Bhattacharjee. You will see it appearing because he is very prolific. So as you're looking through magazines, I'm always reading an article and thinking, this is really cool, and then I'm like, oh yeah, that's Yudhijit. So he is a contributing writer at National Geographic. His features and essays on espionage, cybercrime, science, and medicine have also appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, Wired, and others. He spent 11 years as a staff writer at the weekly journal Science, writing about neuroscience, astronomy, and a variety of other topics in research and science policy. His work has been anthologized in the Best American Science and Nature Writing series. He has an undergraduate degree from the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, and a master's in journalism from the Ohio State University. And he is a fascinating speaker. So join me in welcoming Yudhijit Bhattacharjee.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to the Spy Museum for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. I have a bit of a cold, which I'm hoping will work to my advantage because it'll add like a rich baritone to my voice. But this is a book that I wrote a few years ago. It came out in November of 2016. And it's a fascinating story. And before I start, I wanted to say there's a reason that some of you and many of you might not have heard of Brian Regan, even though this is a landmark espionage case in the annals of American espionage or American intelligence. And the reason is that this man, Brian Regan, who you will meet soon, he was arrested about 2 weeks before the terrorist strikes of September 11, 2001. And he got convicted and sentenced when American forces were in Iraq in 2003. And so his story sort of got bookended between these two major news events, which is the reason that the story just simply got buried. But it has been uncovered, and now I'm going to tell you about this most unusual spy, the spy who couldn't spell. So our story begins with a letter that the FBI got its hands on through an informant at the Libyan embassy, actually the Libyan consulate in New York. It had been mailed to the Libyans in 3 separate envelopes. And one of the envelopes contained a coded letter, about 6 or 7 pages. The second envelope, mailed separately, contained a code book, and the third contained instructions for how to decode this letter. What you see here is the cover sheet that the sender had included with each of these envelopes. As you can see, it says, this letter is confidential and directed to your president or intelligence chief. Please pass this letter via diplomatic pouch and do not discuss the existence of this letter in your offices or homes or via any electronic means. If you do not follow these instructions, the existence of this letter and its contents may be detected and collected by U.S. intelligence agencies. So what the sender was essentially doing was maintaining what's known as communications security. Those of you in the audience with a military background will know that term. The idea being that that even if one of these envelopes had been intercepted by law enforcement, it would have been impossible to find out what the sender was saying. But unfortunately for the sender, all three were intercepted. Don't ask me how, because I don't know. But basically, the FBI has informants in various, places, and clearly there was somebody with access to the Libyan consulate who was able to hand these to the FBI. So, this was not a difficult letter to decode, because the code book and the instructions were included. And this is relevant. This is relevant for later on, when we actually will come across materials that were encrypted, where the code had to be cracked. But in this instance, decoding the letter was simply a matter of following the instructions. And so it was not a difficult, but a tedious job. It took the FBI about 72 hours to sort of get the whole 6 pages in plain text. And what the letter contained, the gist of it was that it was an offer to commit espionage. And it was an offer of hundreds of pages of classified secrets that the sender had access to. Along with the letter, in each of these envelopes actually were a sort of a sampling of the secrets, because the sender wanted to make sure that the Libyans wouldn't take this to be some kind of prank, and that they knew that he was a serious spy, that he actually had the goods that he was offering to deliver. What struck the investigators right away was that this 6-page letter was riddled with spelling mistakes. I've highlighted some of them here: espionage, imprisoned, harassed, compromise, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there was just, dozens of spelling errors. And some of you might be wondering, well, but the letter was coded. How did the spelling errors come about? Well, the code book contained all of these words that then had to be, plugged into the letter. That was the instruction. So that's how it was clear. So in other words, if I had a snapshot of the code book, you would have just seen, lines and lines of misspelled letters. And so this is a theme about the story that we'll be returning to as we go through this presentation. Here was a guy who had tried to maintain, communications security, who'd gone through all this trouble of mailing these separate envelopes, and yet had sort of forgotten to perform the most basic thing of running a spell check. So that's, keep that in mind as we learn more about who this guy was. So, before we come to him, I want to tell you, the FBI immediately launched this massive mole hunt, this spy hunt, in the winter of 2000, early 2001. And the first thing they did was, in the letter, the sender had laid out elaborate instructions for how the Libyans were to make contact with him. And those instructions included a directive to place an ad for a used car, a particular type of used car, in the classified section of the Washington Post. And this ad was supposed to contain a phone number, which the sender would then call in order to establish contact. So once again, sort of an elaborate mind at work. And so the FBI first went through, several months of the Washington Post to try and find that particular used car, and they couldn't, because they couldn't be sure if they were getting this information after the fact, or if this was an espionage plot that was unfolding in real time, or if they were too late. So they placed this ad themselves, hoping that the sender would contact them, and they had an Arabic-trained speaker, manning a phone number, this phone line, and just waiting and waiting. But nobody called, so that was a bust. So they pursued some other clues. And remember, I told you that each of these envelopes contained a sample of secrets, documents, including some satellite images taken by U.S. spy satellites. And so, in fact, one of these images I recall was the image of Gaddafi's yacht, out in the Mediterranean, that had been taken by, I think, Israeli intelligence. So that's the kind of thing that the sender had included. And the FBI quickly realized that these documents had been printed off of Intellink, which is the intelligence community's intranet. And so this is information that had been culled from various servers and then printed. So they launched this massive digital forensics exercise, which, these days you hear about all the time. But remember, this was 2001. Digital forensics was still in its infancy. And they finally were able to trace these documents, the printing of these documents, to a particular computer at the National Reconnaissance Office. Let me tell you very quickly what the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO, is. It's a very, very important intelligence agency. Its budget runs in the billions of dollars because the NRO is responsible for the launching and the maintenance of spy satellites, that provide the U.S. Military with invaluable intelligence. And so when the agents looked at that computer sometime around February or March of 2001, they found that the last person who had worked on it was a man named Patrick Regan, who was a signals analyst, who had been in the Air Force since the year 1980. He had risen to the rank of Master Sergeant, and that's how he had retired in August of 2000. So now that they knew who the suspect could possibly be, they went into Brian Regan's personnel files, and they found that he had submitted things. He had submitted, for example, a rebuttal to a performance appraisal that he wasn't happy with. And this rebuttal, sure enough, was filled with spelling errors. So Brian Regan had been assigned to the agency in 1995. He'd been in the Air Force since 1980, but he came to the NRO in 1995. He was a signals analyst, and he was good at his job. He had won commendations during the first Gulf War. He had worked at the Pentagon, and by all accounts, he had done quite well. And he had a top secret clearance, and he had access to Intellink. So this is what they knew. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough to bring charges, to bring a case. And so the FBI went about collecting more evidence of what Brian Regan was trying to do. And keep in mind that they only had a hazy idea. They knew from the letter that he had documents, that he had somehow stolen documents that he was now offering to the Libyans. But they needed more evidence so that they could make a case for tapping his phones, for bugging his car and things like that. People think that those are just very trivial steps, but actually, because FISA courts require a very high bar for doing things like that, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies must make a really strong case before the FISA court will allow and authorize those kinds of measures. From the letter, the agents knew that Brian Regan had this habit of going into public libraries to use the computer at the public library. And so what what they did was they started keeping tabs on public libraries in between Bowie, Maryland, which is where Brian Regan lived with his family, and Chantilly, Virginia, which is where the NRO's headquarters are still today. And so they just post a few agents, waiting to see if Regan would show up. And sure enough, he did. On June the 13th, 2001, there were a couple of FBI agents keeping an eye on the Crofton Public Library, and they saw Brian Regan, this tall guy that you see in this image. This is a surveillance photo that was taken back then. Well, when else could it have been taken? Stupid thing to say. So he goes into the library, and here I have another image of him. See, this is 2001. Does that bring back memories? That's what computers looked like back then, big boxes. And so he sat down in front of a terminal, and there are these two FBI agents who are milling about in the library, pretending to read newspapers, magazines, trying to peek at what he's looking at. But it wasn't easy, and they couldn't get too close to him. Anyway, they're sort of frustrated that they don't really know what he's looking at. And then he gets up from the terminal. Sorry, I'll put that back. So he gets up from the terminal and walks out. He prints some stuff, he walks out. And one of the agents sort of jumps onto the terminal to see. And, if Regan had closed the browser, it would have been harder for them to figure out what he had been looking at. But once again, this poor speller, who by now the agents had kind of established was severely dyslexic, he had made this basic error of not closing his browser window. So once again, making all these efforts to stay anonymous, to hide himself, not using his home computer to do these searches. So what was he looking at? From just hitting the refresh button and the back button, the agents were able to reconstruct his browsing history. And it turns out that he had been searching for addresses of Iraqi and Libyan embassies in Europe. So they had a hunch that maybe he was now trying to make contact with these embassies. So who is this man, Brian Regan, and what is his story? He grew up on Long Island. He was born in 1962. He was the son of Irish immigrants. He had a tough childhood and a tough adolescence. He grew up in a large family, didn't get a lot of attention. He had this learning disability, so at school he had trouble. And back then, this is the 1970s when he was in school, teachers and students had even less of an understanding of learning disabilities and how different kids learn differently. And so he got mocked at school, he got scolded by teachers. He was basically branded as a stupid person. In fact, his friends in the neighborhood used to call him a retard, as I found out. But he managed to get into the military. Now, granted, he used his height. He was 6'3", used his height to his advantage by peeking over the shoulder of a friend to copy the answers on this military entrance test. That's how he got in. But once he got in, and he scored well enough to go into Air Force intelligence, once he got in, he actually performed quite well. Like I said before, he won commendations. He was a very useful signals analyst. In 1995, after he was assigned to the NRO, once again, this shadow of ridicule never quite left him because of his childhood experiences. He sort of developed this personality where, he needed to always try to prove that he was smart. He had this feeling that others thought he was stupid, but he needed to change their minds. And the more he would try to do that, he would end up doing some foolish things that would reinforce the idea that he wasn't particularly bright. So it's sort of this strange dynamic that followed him through his life, which played a role in sort of shaping the psychology that ultimately led him to become a traitor. So in 1999, while he was at the NRO, he started printing out these secret documents, some of which he had included in the envelopes that I told you about. And I guess IT security wasn't very good back then. And in fact, it continued to be quite lax, in the years that followed, as we know from the Chelsea Manning case and the Edward Snowden case. He was just able to print, thousands of pages of documents, systematically, go to the printer, collect them, first store them in the office, and then smuggle them out of the NRO building by hiding them under his gym clothes. There was a gym at the NRO where he used to work out. And so he just, right under the noses of the guards, he was carrying home, for weeks on end, these large volumes of top secret documents. And actually, I've traced, exactly when, or roughly when, he began to plot this espionage mission. It was sometime in late 1998. Brian Regan had entered the Air Force in 1980. He was due to retire in August of 2000. There's a mandatory 20-year limit unless you advance beyond a certain rank. And at the way that he had advanced, he was going to have to retire. And so he was very anxious about his future. And you'll understand why he was. Here's a little sheet that he maintained. These are all his credit cards. And he had more than 27 credit cards. Now, you might ask, well, why did he have to spend so much money? Well, it's not that he was driving a Porsche, but he had a large family. He had 4 children. His wife was a stay-at-home mom. She was from Sweden. Her name was Annette Regan. And every year, she wanted to go back to Sweden with the kids. That's a lot of money for the kind of salary that Regan was making. She also had these expensive tastes. She was interested in dressage. She had in fact bought a horse and was maintaining this horse while Regan, was struggling. Regan also was not very careful with his money. He would go out, drink a lot, sometimes to get away from the chaos of home. He would go lock himself up in a motel and then just drink himself silly. Since drinking and the stories about drinking are sort of in the news these days, I thought you should know. You might have missed them. But anyway, so he was getting very anxious because he had a lot of debt. That's the tally of just the credit card debt. This is not mortgage, but this is actual. And what he would do was he would pay off, the minimum balance on one card using another. Just terrible financial management. And so he thought, I'm sunk when I retire. And so that's when, at first he thought, I need a get-rich-quick scheme. And he tried various things. He thought that he was an inventor. For example, he came up with these kind of crazy inventions. He made a baby bottle dryer, which was nothing but, a just a stand, with spokes in it, like that you could put baby bottles on. Well, I mean, I don't know if you can patent that, like you can suggest it to a friend and say, hey, you got an extra kid, you're having trouble drying bottles, use this. So none of that worked, of course. And so he thought, I have this idea, I'm going to sell American secrets, and that's how I'll make my money. So what was his plot? As I was explaining to you, he printed secrets and he smuggled them out of the NRO, and I told you how. He wrapped them in garbage bags and he packaged them in Tupperware containers. And then he went out to 2 forests outside of Washington, D.C., one in Virginia and one in Maryland. And he went out there with a shovel and with night goggles. He went out there in the middle of the night on several days, and he buried these stashes of documents. But he still needed to find a buyer because, as we know, the Libyans never responded to that ad, to those instructions to place an ad. The FBI was more or less certain that the Libyans had not done that. And so Regan was getting frustrated. Of course, the FBI didn't know that he had printed out documents. They knew vaguely that he had stolen materials. But all of these details that I'm telling you, this is all hindsight and reconstruction of his activities on Intel-Link. So let's just keep in mind how much the investigators themselves knew. They just knew that this guy was out to commit espionage, that he had top secret security clearance, he had access to Intel-Link, he had probably stolen documents. They didn't know how much. There's a funny story I tell in the book, actually, about that exemplifies the lack of security at the NRO back then when Regan was printing out these documents. He'd gone out, there was a credenza in his office, and he had bundled some of these documents, and he had locked them up in his credenza. So he was away on travel when some of the office managers at the NRO decided to clear out excess furniture from the building. And so they came in and they said, hey, whose credenza is this? Nobody answered, nobody owned up to it. And so they took it away, and then they had to pick the lock because they could tell that it was heavy. And then they opened the drawer and they saw, oh, there's papers in here. But instead of reporting it to NRO security, they simply called Brian Regan when he came back from his travels and said, hey, we took this credenza from your office. Does this stuff belong to you? And he said, oops, yeah, it does, in fact. Can I have it back? And then he took it back, and then he took it home. So that's just to give you an example. But even though he had collected all this material, he was still looking for a buyer. Now bear in mind that Regan had retired in August of 2000, and we're right now in the June-July time frame in 2001. Now Regan had been hired by TRW, which is a defense contractor. I think now it's merged with another company, I forget. I think maybe now they're part of Booz Hamilton. But TRW had hired him as a contractor, and his new job was going to be to go back to the NRO and work for them again. And so it was at this point that the FBI had to make some very tough decisions. The lead investigator, an FBI agent named Stephen Carr, went to the NRO director at the time. The director was a man named Keith Hall. And he went to Keith Hall and said, look, we are pretty certain that this former employee has stolen documents from the NRO. He's trying to sell them. And we need to prosecute him. We need to catch him red-handed in the act of espionage. And we know that he is supposed to come back here as a contractor. And a lot of the top managers at the NRO said, "Are you crazy? We're not letting this guy back in here so he can do more damage." But Carr made a convincing argument. He said, "Look, if you just let him go, then we don't know what he's going to do. He's already got material. He's going to try to sell it. He's going to maybe get a job at another agency as a contractor." So Keith Hall took this bold step of agreeing with Carr and overruling many of his deputies. And he said, "Okay, you've got 90 days in which to catch this guy. We will grant him the security clearance so that he can come back and work here." And so he came back, I think August 1st or August 2nd, Brian Regan was back at the NRO, not at the NRO headquarters, but at another facility run by the NRO. And as soon as he came back, the FBI had this, all of these measures to basically track his every move. They had a camera, a hidden camera in his cubicle up on the ceiling. They had a monitoring room from where they could monitor every keystroke that he was making on his computer. And they had other measures as well. And so as soon as he came back, first thing he does is he starts to search, new documents. He's now searching missile sites in northern Iraq. He's searching, missile sites in China and so on. So they know that his plan is still on. And as soon as he comes in, he applies for leave. This is a whiteboard from Regan's office. All of the other names have been redacted. But he says that 27th to 30th August, he's going off to Orlando, Florida. And he tells his boss that I'm planning this vacation with my kids. I'm going to be driving. And of course, the FBI knows that that's not what he's about to do, because they know that he's buying air tickets to go to Europe, where he's planning to visit some of those embassies, the addresses of which he was looking up at the Crofton Library terminal. So here's a picture of him taken on August the 23rd. This is the overhead surveillance camera I told you about. This is the day that he is planning to fly to Zurich in the afternoon. So he comes in at 8 o'clock and he starts to scribble some notes into a little spiral pad, and he does a bunch of other things that I sort of describe in detail in the book and won't get into. But to make a long story short, in the afternoon, as he's about to board his flight for Zurich, he is arrested, or he's actually detained by FBI agents. They Steve Carr and a couple of other people, they get up on this shuttle, which drives you from one terminal to the next. They get on the shuttle and they bring him in for questioning. And meanwhile, they've already, through surreptitious methods, they've already looked into all of his luggage that he had checked in, and they have made copies of all the materials that he's taking along with him. Well, what was he taking along with him? He had a manila folder on him which contained 4 sheets that looked like this, a curious assortment of trinomes, with a header saying letter MI34. There were a few other letters like that. And of course, this is like gobbledygook. And they asked him what these things were, and he said, it's nothing. I like to play with puzzles. This is just my hobby or something. And of course, the agents are starting to think that this might be some kind of code that that's meant to hide his espionage plot. But that's not all. He also has, hidden in between his outer and inner sole of his shoe, he has these addresses. He has one note containing several addresses. This is the address for the Chinese embassy in Bern, Switzerland. And then there's also the Chinese embassy in Paris, the Chinese consulate in Paris. And they find in his wallet or somewhere else on his person, they find a little index card with this string of letters and numbers. And this is also clearly a code that subsequently a cryptanalyst at the FBI named Dan Olson, who also is featured prominently in my book, he sort of decodes this or decrypts this, and it turns out to be the address of a Swiss bank. And as we learn later on, Regan's plan was to walk into the embassy, make a transaction, hand them those coded letters or hand them something, and I'll come to it later, and make off with a sizable chunk of the $13 million that he wanted in exchange for these secrets. And then he was just going to maybe take a cab to a Swiss bank and then open an account there and deposit the money over there. Now, confronted with this kind of evidence, usually spies end up confessing. They try to strike a plea bargain, and that's the reason that most counterintelligence cases don't reach the courts. By that I mean most of them are not tried in court, in open court. They get settled well before that. The person with clearance, has to plead guilty, goes to prison or whatever. But what Brian Regan did was very strange. He stuck to his guns. He thought that the FBI did not know what he had taken. He was pretty confident that they wouldn't be able to find the materials that he had stolen. And so, in fact, what he told the FBI through his lawyers, what he told the prosecutors through his lawyers, was that he had stuff buried out there that could start a war, and that the only way that he was going to cooperate in the recovery of these materials was if he got a short prison sentence. So he was in fact trying to blackmail the government. Not only that, what you see here are sort of trinomes that he was generating in prison. He was just scribbling these things, and these were made to look very similar to the trinomes that had been found in his Manila folder. But Dan Olson, the cryptanalyst, did a bunch of analysis and showed that, in fact, these were fake codes and meaningless trinomes. And the way that, even though he had not been able to decrypt the actual trinomes, he was able to show statistically that these trinomes were meaningless, whereas the others were different. I go into detail about that in my book. You're going to hear of my book a lot. So, yes, as a matter of fact, a helpful public announcement. So Brian Regan was, he was clearly playing with fire, because the prosecution now decided that this will set a dangerous precedent. If we somehow succumb to this guy's blackmail, what message does that send to the next spy? But there were some differences of opinion, within the defense community, within the people that were involved in this case, because the NRO was desperate, actually, to get all of these materials back. And so the NRO was actually pressurizing the Department of Justice to strike some kind of deal to reduce the sentence so that they could get all the materials back. But DOJ was standing firm. Now, what that meant was that the FBI agents, even though they had arrested Brian Regan, they had another task ahead of them, which was to figure out what Brian Regan had stolen and where he might have hidden the stolen stuff. Now, one thing that made the prosecution's case stronger was that the prosecution was unable to use the letter that it had gotten from the informant. That might sound strange to you, but because the FBI is duty-bound to protect its methods and sources, they could not go in open court and reveal that letter that the informant had given them, because the defense would have immediately said, well, how did you get this letter? How do we know that you just didn't make it up, right? And that would have required the prosecution to call the informant into the witness box, and of course that they could not do. However, they finally discovered the same letter on Brian Regan's laptop. And once again, Regan, trying to be so clever with everything, so cautious, and yet makes this very stupid mistake of not scrubbing his hard drive. And so in the slack space of the hard drive of his laptop, agents find this letter. Not only do they find the letter, but they find that there are replicas of this letter. And it turns out that Regan has written several versions of this letter. Well, they're essentially the same, but he's written them to Iraq, he's written them to Iran, he has written them to Libya, of course, and he's written them to a few other countries. So Brian Regan was kind of a pioneer because he was looking to commit what came to be known as form letter espionage, literally. I mean, he was looking for, the best buyer out there. And it turns out also, as it later became clear, he'd gone through these old cases and made sure that he did not contact the Russians, because he was worried that the Russian spy agencies were starting to collaborate with the U.S. back then. This was 2001 or 99, 2001 timeframe, and they thought that maybe they would give him up to the American spy agencies. So now what the prosecutors did was they filed, now they had even more material. They had a strong case now because they could show that Regan had written that letter, and that was, clinching evidence of what he was trying to do. But, and so they tried to twist his arm into now cooperating and surrendering all the material that he had stolen. And he still did not agree. He still wanted less prison time as part of his deal. And so at this point, the prosecution got furious, and they filed a motion to seek the death penalty. And it would have been the first time in 50 years since the Rosenberg trial in 1953 that American law enforcement, that the American justice system was seeking the death penalty against a traitor. Even that did not, did not make Regan budge from his stance. In fact, he doubled down on his position, and what he did was, this was another very stupid thing that he did. He decided to send his wife, Annette, a secret letter asking her to go out into the woods. He directed her to various places out in the woods, and he asked her to go out and bury these little McDonald's toys and knickknacks and things like that, because he was planning to create this alibi for himself, that he thought that maybe while he was being surveilled, that maybe FBI agents had seen him going into the woods and they would bring that up at trial. And so he wanted to say, well, here's what I was really doing when I went to the woods. I had these McDonald's toys and I was creating this treasure hunt for my kids. And so Annette, equally stupidly, followed his advice because she thought that he was innocent. He had managed to fool her into thinking that he hadn't done anything. And she went out and she did this. She buried these things. But the FBI found out, and they went to her, they got the secret letter, they took her to all the sites where she had buried these things. And now, there was double jeopardy, because now the prosecution could bring charges against her for obstruction of justice, which was basically another way in which that he could that they could twist his arm. Well, that did not change things very much. From Brian Regan's point of view, there was a trial about, I think, 9 or 10 days in early 2003. Brian Regan was convicted, and then he was sentenced. But then as part of his bargain at that point, he was finally, he gave up. And he said, okay, now that I'm sentenced, what do I have to do? And they said, look, if you cooperate with us, then we won't file charges against your wife. And so that was the deal that was struck. And so he said, okay, I'll help you recover all the stuff that I have stolen. And that's when he revealed that he had printed out thousands of pages, and that he had gone and buried them at 2 places, one in Pocahontas State Park in Virginia, and the other site was the Patapsco State Park in Maryland. And so right away, the FBI, Steve Carr, and a bunch of other people from the FBI, from the NRO, from the CIA, they drove to this. They drove down I-95 South to this exit sign. Why did they drive to this exit sign? So let me back up. So Regan said that he had, that they were right, that the FBI's hunch was right, that all of those materials that they had confiscated from the Manila folder were actually encryptions of coordinates, of geocoordinates, where he had buried these stashes of documents. But he said that they did not need to decode, they did not need to decrypt the Virginia coordinates, because he had buried the actual coordinates, the plain text coordinates, near this exit sign out by, near Fredericksburg. And so this is like a surreal scene with all these FBI agents with metal detectors going up and down next to the exit sign, looking for what Regan had described as a toothbrush holder, which contained, these plain text coordinates. I actually have a little video to show you here. So, sure enough, after about 2 hours, they're able to dig up the toothbrush holder, and those are Stephen Carr's hands opening up plain text coordinates for the sites in Virginia. So, without wasting any time, the FBI goes off to Pocahontas, and they start digging, and they're able to recover 11 of the 12 stashes buried there, just based on the plain text coordinates. But the 12th, in fact, let me show you a little scene. There. So, 11 of the packages were recovered just like that, and it was fairly straightforward. But the 12th one, turns out that Regan, because of his dyslexia, had sort of messed up the digits. And so that particular package proved to be very problematic. And so the FBI had to rely on Dan Olson to decrypt that particular site. And I'm not going into the detail of the decryption, but what I can tell you is that there was a cipher that Regan had used, and that involved the phone list from the NRO. So he had used that as a key, and there were a number of steps that you had to go through before you could use the encrypted coordinates and the key to come up with the actual coordinates. So now you think the story is over, right? But no, it isn't. Because what Regan had done was he had a second set of packages that he had buried in Patapsco. And he had buried them here as sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card kind of bargaining chip that he was hoping to use if he got caught. So what he told the agents was that he was planning to sell the stashes in Virginia, but he was planning to hold on to these stashes. But of course, the agents knew that sooner or later he would have sold those too. So here's what, in the toothbrush holder that I described to you earlier, Regan said there was a sheet with the coordinates, with the encrypted coordinates for the 7 sites in Maryland, in Patapsco, where he had buried these extra 7 packages. And here's what that looked like. This is that sheet. Now you'd think, well, why would it be so hard? Because they had managed to find out how to decrypt his Virginia coordinates. Well, it turns out that Brian Regan was not very systematic in this instance. He used a completely different coding scheme to encrypt the coordinates in Maryland. And guess what? He also did not have a copy of the plaintext coordinates for the sites in Maryland. This is what it looked like, starting with number 1, and then again these trinomes mixed up with some alpha numerals. If you just read through that first line, 146 da 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 958 431 13A 11A 40A, etc., etc. Now, but what's the problem? Regan could have just told them. There was one problem. Because he had done this encryption 3 years prior, he had forgotten how he had encrypted these coordinates. So he had no idea. I mean, he had some vague idea, but a vague idea wouldn't work. And so Dan Olson was entrusted to sort of brainstorm with Brian Regan to try and ferret out how Regan might have encrypted these coordinates. There were a few things that Brian Regan remembered. He remembered that he had used as a key his Mill Lane Junior High yearbook from 1977. Once again, yearbooks are in the news. And the other thing was that the number 1 at the top of the sheet was a reference to his image. Obviously, I mean, who would be number 1 but himself? But that's all that Dan Olson knew. And so Olson sort of went through the yearbook backwards and forwards, trying to figure out some other clues that would help to decrypt. And in fact, there was one clue. And he found out that what Olson noticed was that there was a mystery man image in the yearbook. And that was the only image on top of which something had been written by hand, the name Frank. And so some ink analysis was done, and it was discovered that a gel pen had been used to write this word Frank. And gel pens weren't around back then in 1977. So it was clear that Brian Regan had written Frank over that image as part of his encryption. And so that was a clue. And so then Olson sort of questioned Regan about why he might have used Frank.
And finally it came out that he needed that first letter. Oh, actually, that's not how it came out. From analyzing all of the images and the names in the yearbook, Olson was able to find out that there was not a single name after Brian Regan that started with the letter F. So that initial was something that Regan needed for his encryption scheme. That's why he had written Frank. And it turns out that F stood for feet. So that marked the number of feet. So here's a decrypted version of this. Again, I'm not going into the details of it because it really requires like images and diagrams and things like that. And I encourage you to buy the book because you will learn all of it. But basically, every image and every name, so you had to count a certain number of names from Brian Regan's image and then look up that name and then use, if it was an alpha numeral like 13A, you had to use just the first initial of the name and so on. It was a very complex scheme. But even that was not helpful enough until Olson noticed something peculiar about the sheet. He noticed that this part that's highlighted over here down below, he saw that none of the alpha numerals appeared in those last two lines starting with 141. And that was strange to Olson because alpha numerals kind of are interspersed throughout the rest, 13A, 16A, 14A, whatever. And so he started to probe Regan in jail. They'd come out to this Alexandria detention facility to a conference room, and they'd just be brainstorming. And so he was asking Brian, hey, Brian, what's different? Why is that different? Why doesn't it contain any alpha numerals? And Regan just couldn't remember until, he was sent to his jail cell with the sheet and the yearbook. And finally, he called Steve Carr after the weekend and said, those are plain text coordinates. So those were actually like a backdoor security that Regan had created. Those are those are the actual coordinates for where those packages were buried. What he had done was, he was always worried about forgetting. Now, he forgot that he had done that too, but he was worried about forgetting, and so as an insurance policy, he had written down the plain text coordinates such that they were hidden in plain sight at the bottom of this sheet. So, now you'd think, okay, now it's done because they have all the coordinates. But GPS is not that precise. And in Virginia, he had used a simpler scheme for where he had buried these. He had nails that he had hammered into trees near the sites where he had buried things. Here, he had hammered nails, but he had hammered nails sort of a certain distance away. I told you that the letter F is important. He had actually hammered nails onto trees that were a certain feet away because he wanted to be even more secure over there. And so for weeks and weeks, the FBI did this massive search at Patapsco Park trying to dig up these materials, and they couldn't. They found the trees with the nails hammered in them, but any GPS coordinate, there's kind of there's a degree of uncertainty. It could be anywhere within sort of 30, 40 feet. And so, the FBI went out there day after day with a bobcat, with shovels. There would be joggers going down the park saying, hey, are they going to build a Walmart here? That's how big some of these trenches were that they had dug, and yet they had failed. And so that's when finally Steve Carr appealed to his bosses to let him bring
Brian Regan out of prison, out to the woods so that he could help them. And it was just, they were just struck by the visual memory that Brian possessed. He was able to lead them, just from looking at the incline of the hill, from looking at sort of the general configuration of the trees. I mean, they were already in close proximity to the packages, don't get me wrong. They were just not able to actually get the precise locations. And he was able to guide them to the precise locations just from memory. Sorry, I had a video there actually. That's Brian Regan with the shackles. And that's Steve Carr, who's digging right here in this checkered shirt. So that's the crestfallen look of a man who has been caught and is now going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Incidentally, in one of those packages, they found, like in the wrapping, they found a sticky note saying Brian Regan. And that's the Signals Applications Office. SAO stands for Signals Applications Office. So again, he had gone through all of this trouble, and yet he had slipped up in this crucial way. And this is what led one of the FBI agents, an intelligence analyst, to sort of come up with this name for Brian Regan. He called him Mr. 80%. Where Brian Regan would be phenomenal, like 80% of the way, and then suddenly he'd make this bizarre left turn to stupidity, not closing the browser, not running a spell check, so on and so forth, and you'll know more of that in the book. So, more than 20,000 documents, discs, videos, just a massive volume of material that would have fallen into enemy hands if the FBI hadn't gotten to it. And I want to say a thank you to Stephen Carr, who is one of the agents who contracted, cancer, basically developed cancer from having worked at the Pentagon site in 2001. And unfortunately, even though Steve was able to beat his leukemia several times, and he was in fact, he was undergoing the experimental therapy that was recently awarded the Nobel Prize, this year. Even so, unfortunately, as I was finishing the book, Steve passed away, and I miss him every day. And that's it. Thank you.
I think you're Mr. 100%. So. Any questions?
Amanda, I have one back here.
Oh, great.
Thank you for a great presentation. At the outset, you said that they traced Regan by his printer at NRO. How did they do that?
So, yeah, so I'll repeat the question. The question was, how exactly did they connect those documents, the sample secrets, to the computer at the NRO? And the answer to that is that, they were able to figure out from the servers what computers those documents had been accessed on that particular day, July the 9th, the year 99. Because they were able to reconstruct the header and footer of these documents that had been printed. And back then, the date that it had been printed on would appear on the header. So they used that information to find out, well, when were these, what computers accessed these documents on that day? And they had roughly 6 of them. And then they went back and did more forensics, and the NRO was one of those places. So that's how. But great question.
One right here.
Was anything that was stolen ever successfully sold?
To my knowledge, no. And according to the FBI, no. The FBI was 100% successful in sort of stopping this espionage in its tracks. But I do have to tell you that that Brian Regan made contact with the Libyans. It's in the book. I'm going to leave you with that.
One back here.
So I'm envisioning the Libyan government hiring a bobcat and trying to dig up a park. What was the likelihood that if this information had gotten to the right source, that they would have been able to recover the information he was selling to them?
Well, I think that Brian Regan's plan was, I think he was working, he always had these redundancies in his plan. And I think his plan A was to just give them these encrypted coordinates and say, now you go find them, okay? And obviously it wouldn't have worked. And so obviously they wouldn't have accepted the offer. They would have said, are you crazy? We'll go to the state park and look for documents. I don't think it's going to work. We won't offer you any money. At which point he would have said, all right, fine. I'll go back and dig them up myself. So for him, the encryption was a way to simply keep it secure until he came to that step in his plan.
I have another one back here.
Yes.
2 questions. I assume he's in a federal prison somewhere today.
Yes.
And whatever happened to his family?
Well, so he is in prison for life with no chance of parole. And he's at a prison in Jonesville, Virginia. I have never spoken to him because he's under these special restrictions that the government imposes on a very, very small class of prisoners, spies, terrorists, and so on. His family is doing okay. Annette managed to do a stellar job of raising the family after he ended up in prison. She got a nursing degree. She went and became a nurse. She did not cooperate with this book, but I know that that she was able to raise the 4 kids, and I don't name the kids in the book because they played no part in it. And I don't know where Annette lives right now. I'm sure she doesn't want me to know.
Oh, right. I'll do one from this side.
Sure.
Did he plead guilty? Was there a trial?
There was a trial, yes. There was a trial and he was convicted.
There you go.
The other letters to the other countries,
Yeah.
whatever happened to them?
That's
Was the
a great-
FBI able to find out or anything, or did he actually send them?
He
or-
did send them. He did send them, but nobody ever got back to him. At least that's how much, that's what the FBI concluded.
But the samples that he provided in those letters got into the hands of those other countries, right?
Yes, they
Ah.
did.
Do you have any explanation for why he chose those particular countries?
Well, he wanted to avoid Russia because this was the end of the 90s. Several American traitors had been caught, earlier in 94, 95. And so he thought that this would just be, a better bet. And also, actually, there's a better reason for it. The reason is that he was an expert in that region. As a signals analyst, he had worked on Iraq and Sudan and things. So he actually knew sort of the geopolitical importance of all the information that he was trying to sell. I mean, of course, he didn't know how to sell it. in the end, that's what was his undoing. Yes, please.
How did someone with over $100,000 in credit card debt keep their clearance? Like, aren't those?
That's a great question. Now, I think back then, these clearances, these checks weren't done every year. They were done like once every 5 years. And I don't think that having some debt automatically disqualifies you from a security clearance. You just have to explain things, or you might be under special watch. Again, I don't exactly know, but it's a great question that I've been asked several times, and I think in more recent years, after more lapses, I think the security clearance process has been tweaked to try to take care of some of the concerns that were raised by the Regan affair. There was a lady up here.
How did you happen to pick him?
Right. So that how did I come across the story? How did I come across the story? Is what you're asking? I used to work at Science Magazine, and back in 2008, I was covering the anthrax letter attacks, and so I happened to kind of become friendly with the director of the FBI lab in Quantico, which had been doing a bunch of forensic work on that case. And so he invited me to the FBI lab and suggested, meeting with this cryptanalyst, Dan Olson, that I described. And so my plan was to just write up a profile of Dan Olson, thinking that he had worked on interesting cases. And in fact, Olson had spent much of his career cracking these encoded messages that prison gangs will pass amongst each other, and gambling and racketeering records that are often encoded in special ways. And then so he was describing these various cases. And then he said, and then there was this espionage case that I worked on. So that's how I learned about it. But really, if I'd been paying attention, I would have learned about it in 2003 when, it's not like it wasn't covered at all. There were a few news stories that had appeared. But because of that, of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, right when he was getting sentenced, there was no follow-up, and it wasn't until the summer of 2003 that they recovered these packages. And so the actual story of the codes and, none of that had been told. And so I thought it was fascinating. And I was fascinated just by the guy himself, because I thought, here's a guy who everyone else thinks is less smart than he is, and who himself thinks is a lot smarter than he actually is. So there's this mismatch between who he thinks, himself to be. I think it was Tolstoy who said, a man is a fraction. What he is being the numerator, and what he thinks of himself being the denominator. The greater the denominator, the lesser the man. And so I can think of a few other characters in the news today who that description would apply to.
I have one back here.
Could you pronounce your name again so I
Sure.
can say it correctly?
Yeah, it's Yudhijit Bhattacharjee. I can say it a few more times.
Hold on, I have one up here.
Going back to the FISA warrant,
Yeah.
did the FBI ever succeed in getting that? And
Yes, it
would
did.
it have made much of a difference because he was a lone wolf? He would not have been communicating with anyone with phones or
Right.
internet and stuff.
Well, knowing what we know now, yes, you're right that his communications, were not that helpful. But I think making the case for 24/7 surveillance, those things were also very important to the case. But yeah, you're right, because he was working, but they didn't know that at the time, like he could have called a Libyan guy, and then they might have picked up something.
How were you able to get to use the videos and really interesting photos that you put in your presentation in your book?
Well, because those things are not classified, and the FBI has cooperated pretty extensively with me on the case, on the telling of the case. I mean, it took several years. Some of the materials were actually declassified to help tell the story. But those videos by themselves were never classified. They were always, they were unclassified.
I think at the trial, one of the things that he claimed was that the information that he had taken wasn't really very important, and that for that reason he shouldn't be heavily punished for that. And I realize that that because it was classified information, the FBI probably was not eager to discuss a lot of the information that they found. But do you know whether this was really significant classified information that he had taken and that they recovered?
Oh, yes. I mean, if you look at the full volume of what he had taken, he just took a huge amount of top secret classified information that would have been very helpful to Iran, to Sudan, to Libya, to a lot of countries in the Middle East. And they would have hurt the United States. In fact, some of the information that he had given out just as samples was also not trivial. It wasn't as super sensitive as some of the stuff that he was planning to sell. So no, the straight answer is that I don't know that information. I mean, that is classified information. But I have little tidbits that explain why that information was important. The orbits, the schedules of various spy satellites. That's really important, because if that is disclosed, then countries can start to hide their military installations at certain times of day, based on their knowledge of when the satellites pass overhead. So that's an example. And actually, there's a scene in my book where I describe Brian Regan staying at this motel near the Pocahontas State Park, where he's sorting all these packages and he's planning to go out and bury them in the middle of the night. And then he comes across some material that has to do with nuclear information. And there's something in his conscience, actually, that tugs at him, because he thinks that this is just so sensitive that he does not want to sell this. I mean, this is kind of a redeeming little moment in his life. And so what he tries to do is he needs to destroy this. So he fills up, the first thing he does is he tries to flush it down the toilet. And that clogs up the toilet, I mean, once again, just he does these very silly things sometimes. And so then he fills up the tub with water and he tries to mulch all these documents into a soggy mess and then carries it all out to a dumpster and dumps it. So nobody's recovered that soggy mess, but I assume that that the ink would have washed off.